SIGNALIS is a game that I can't stop thinking about. The games industry has dumped piles upon piles of money, investing in better equipment and technology in their attempt to tell better stories. And yet, game after game, I'm left wanting more, wanting something to fulfill the curiosity and existential questions deep within my soul. This little gem that is touted online as the return of classic survival horror is one of the smartest, most ambitious, and intelligently written stories, not just in video games, but across all art forms. I am of the firm opinion that SIGNALIS is one of the most important video games of the 21st century, and writers from all across the world should be furiously taking notes and observing what this game is doing to push the limits of storytelling in this medium. Horror is arguably the most versatile, flexible, and rewarding genre in the video game landscape. It is unique in the sense that it predicates itself on emotional responses evoked by each unique experience provided by whichever horror title is in question. The spectrum of emotions which it operates within allows it to be an evergreen source of innovation, constantly coming up with brand new ways to be terrified, unsettled, disturbed, and shaken to the core. This ever-growing spectrum within the horror genre is dominated primarily by two of its subgenres, survival horror and psychological horror. These are the two broadest brushstrokes on the canvas that is the horror genre, and they generally serve as the entire premise, the foundation on which the experience of a horror title is built on top of. Survival horror, as the name implies, concerns itself with horrific scenarios and premises in which the main character or cast of characters' primary concern, above all else, is to survive until the credits roll. Of the two subgenres, survival horror operates more on instinct rather than intellect, seeking to use the horror scenarios at hand to provide an experience that is both fun and stressful in equal measure. Say you are relentlessly chased by a predator in the wilderness. Your brain goes into survival mode, thinking about your choices on a moment-to-moment basis, where every second, every tactic, and every last ounce of resource at your disposal matters until the situation is either resolved or met with a gruesome demise. Video games interpret these real-life experiences and gamifies them to come up with fictional horror scenarios that can be experienced in a safe and entertaining way from the comfort of your home or your pockets. It's supposed to scare you as you are playing the game, but that fear evaporates once you put down the controller or reach the end credits. That is the essence of survival horror. On the other hand, psychological horror covers an opposite yet equally vast range of horrific scenarios, ones that are far less urgent in nature and more intellectually demanding than anything else. If survival horror is about what do I do right now in this moment, psychological horror operates just outside of those parameters. If the former is about asking, how the hell do I get this grizzly bear to not wear my face on its face? The latter one is about asking, where the hell is the bear? If you know there's a bear somewhere out in the woods, but you haven't seen it, your brain starts imagining all the ways it can come into the night to drag you down by the waterfall and turn you into some side dish to go nicely along with the sushi it's having for dinner. If you've already survived an encounter with a bear, you may have won the battle, but the war may not be over. You start picturing its return, and you may not be so lucky next time. Your brain starts to go into overdrive, thinking of all the ways it can cope and recover from such a traumatic experience. Depending on who you are as a person, your brain either goes into proactive mode, taking action to make sure those future risks are mitigated or eliminated altogether, or it buckles under its own weight and it starts to overcomplicate things. That bear might never ever show up again in your lifetime, and yet you are permanently scarred, forever imagining a monster that simply isn't there. Maybe it was never there to begin with. It goes without saying that the bear is simply a metaphor here, and such worries of the mind can manifest and shape themselves into a myriad of other ways. It's an experience that warrants contemplation and pondering, either long before it happens or long after it's over. The bear is a worst-case scenario in terms of external factors one can be scared of in the real world, but even the smallest of external factors can become catalysts for your entire internal mechanisms to come crumbling down. Most games within the psychological horror genre are like that. They're hardly scary as you play them. It's when you put the controller down or reach the end credits that the terror starts to sink in. 24 years ago, Silent Hill 1 diverged from Resident Evil's trajectory of survival horror and gave birth to the psychological horror game. Up until then, that specific subgenre was confined to other forms of media, books like The Silence of the Lambs, movies like The Shining, TV shows like Twin Peaks, or even paintings such as The Scream by Edvard Munch. 22 years ago, Silent Hill 2 left an indelible mark on the genre. If the first installment towed the line between psychological horror and survival horror, the second one is undoubtedly psychological horror at its finest moment. It is an accolade that it held for well over 2 decades. There have been plenty of great titles in this genre, but Silent Hill 2 held on to the crown. That might no longer be the case because Signalis might just be the newly appointed king of the psychological horror genre. From the extraordinary minds of the 2-person team over at indie developer Rose Engine, Yuri Stern and Barbara Whitman, comes a small horror game that successfully punches so far above its weight, it can give the competition an absolute concussion. That's not hyperbole. If you thought the Callisto Protocol was a decent thrill ride and perhaps you've even gushed about how remarkable the Dead Space remake is, I know I have, Signalis actually rivals these 2 AAA giants in ways that they'll never stand a chance at winning. Signalis is a pure work of art. Every single frame of the experience, from its vague but intriguing beginning to an even more vague but melancholic end, is unmistakably crafted with love and attention to detail. Details that are so meticulous yet so deliberately open-ended that I have no doubt the game will generate discussions and hypotheses for years to come, just like Silent Hill 2 did before it. I say pure work of art, not just in the casual sense that it's an effective piece of emotional elicitation, but almost in a literal sense. I can sit here and give you a reductionist slogan like Signalis, the return of classic survival horror, or I can go against the grain and tell you that Signalis is actually a psychological horror masterpiece disguised as a survival horror game. Instead, I'm gonna give you an answer that is somehow even stranger. Signalis feels like a Cubism painting. I'm not going to pretend I'm well versed when it comes to the Cubism art movement, however I draw this comparison for a reason. Cubism is a 20th century art movement created by George Braque and Pablo Picasso, and it broke the mold on how art should be perceived, abandoning the idea of capturing a scene in great detail and fidelity from a singular perspective, to instead breaking a scene down into the simplest of shapes captured from as many different perspectives as possible. Despite the simplicity and flatness of the shapes, the different angles and perspectives create a complicated, nuanced piece that depicts something that is simultaneously unfathomably distorted and yet unapologetically truthful and accurate all at once. There is no right or wrong answer when it comes to interpreting a Cubism painting, and one could say that's what makes Cubism so remarkable. A straightforward answer defeats the whole purpose, or at the very least, it does so for the artist who painted it. This analogy, however, can be taken one step further. Given how Signalis' Cubism-esque storytelling leans heavily into human psychology, symbolism, and dreamlike qualities to disturb and unsettle the viewer, it is perhaps more accurate to describe Signalis as a surrealist work of art. It is true that condensing the story of Signalis into one correct answer might be the wrong way of looking at it, and it probably is. However, I'm assuming you clicked on this video specifically to know what my interpretation of the material is. I could be right, I could be wrong, I could be both. The same could be said for the countless other perspectives and interpretations that have already and will continue to circulate the internet, and I'd argue it is the confusion of differing opinions on the story that will cement the legacy of Signalis' genius storytelling. A good chunk of this video will be a straightforward review, but if you would like to hear what I think the story is about and why I think it's a psychological horror game rather than a survival horror game, I'd encourage you to stick around until the end. If you're enjoying the video so far, I put my heart and soul into the content that I make. By simply clicking the like button, you would be helping me out more than you could ever imagine. If you would like to go the extra mile in supporting me, consider subscribing and following me on social media links. From here on out, I present to you my review and understanding of Signalis. I usually start out a typical review by talking about a game's premise, but I want to cover the gameplay first, and that's because the gameplay, solid and competent as it is, ranks at the very bottom of what I think is special about Signalis. If gameplay was all the meat on this title's bones, this video would be over before you could even heat up an electric kettle. Signalis plays almost exactly like 90% of horror games from the PlayStation 1 and 2 days, even if the camera angle seems to suggest otherwise. So let's start off with the perspective. Signalis doesn't use traditional fixed camera angles, and it doesn't even mimic dynamic camera angles. Dynamic angles do move on rails like Signalis' camera does, but the difference is that in other games, say Code Veronica or Tormented Souls, both of which I've reviewed extensively on the channel, they move with the purpose of transitioning smoothly from one camera angle to the next with little to no awkwardness. Signalis doesn't do that. Instead, it uses a 2.5D perspective akin to highly acclaimed titles such as Inside and Little Nightmares. No matter where you go, the camera will always follow you from side to side and from top to bottom, but it will never rotate or surprise you with a camera angle switch. In fact, this is why Signalis doesn't benefit at all from tank controls, even if the option is available for purists that want to make use of it. I usually like to use tank controls in these old school type of games, even though I'm not a purist by any means, and yet for Signalis I found the modern controls to be much more suitable. When it comes to the style of gameplay, Signalis is unequivocally a classical, super old school horror game. This particular style of gameplay puts an emphasis on avoidance and engenders passivity. In case you're wondering why I'm refraining from using tired old phrases like true survival horror or classic survival horror, it's for a really simple reason. It just feels wrong. While Signalis as a game is without a shred of a doubt an instant classic, even if it is a sleeper hit, the style of horror that it goes for is traditional and old-fashioned, not the norm. That falls under the definition of classical, not classic. I don't mean to be so pedantic, but with how much confusion there seems to be in discussions about what even is survival horror, I couldn't help but want to address the obvious elephant in the room before we proceed. Kicking off the old school horror mechanics is the strict inventory system. Usually it is enough to call it a limited inventory system, but here it would be the understatement of the century. Most horror titles offer a degree of wiggle room if you feel unprepared for what comes next, but in Signalis the inventory system requires you to be a borderline perfectionist. This is a game that truly gets you to question if you actually need the items that you think that you need. Say you play Resident Evil 1 as Chris Redfield with only 6 item slots. Usually you can get by with a handgun, some bullets, and a healing item. As long as you stick to the rule of 3, the number of slots you ideally should leave empty just in case, there should be no problems. But in Signalis, even such frugality will be tested to its limits. Many times you can't afford to take extra ammo because you've already taken some defensive item or a healing item in case things go south. Most of the time you can only take one weapon and that's it. All you can do is reload the weapon and pray that whatever's loaded in the chamber or left in the magazine will suffice for the journey ahead. The interesting thing about Signalis is that even though the game wants you to feel like a little chihuahua barking up the wrong tree at every corner, the game actually gives you a really interesting arsenal of tools and weapons to use. For traditional firearms, you got the simple but effective pistol, a snub-nosed revolver that's somehow almost as powerful as a magnum, the trusty crowd control shotgun, a submachine gun which frankly I never found myself using much, I think it's a waste of ammo and inventory space, and a rifle that kicks like a mule, which I always save for the final boss. The game also gives you defensive items to mess around with. You can find and collect stun rods that can temporarily put down enemies with a single hit and a stomp, but for the really obnoxious enemies such as the ones that patrol outside of the save rooms, you can get in real close and stick thermite onto their bodies or even place them on corpses you've already put down with ammunition. And if you run out of these things, the game even gives you a flare gun that doubles as a grenade launcher. The grenade rounds don't seem to be as powerful, they seem to work better when fired on a whole cluster of enemies for an easy takedown, but the flare shells are a lifesaver. The biggest and probably only real complaint from most Signalis fans is that Elster's flashlight module takes up inventory space. There is a way to alleviate this problem, particularly if you get the hang of the push and shove mechanic. It's a parry system that helps take the edge off a bit. The rule of 6 is a recurring theme in Signalis, so I have no doubt there's an intention behind this choice, but as to why Elster does not bother breaking the pattern, that's where things might seem a little muddy. Many have argued that the flashlight, the eidetic module, and the defensive items should be separate from the item slots, but given how everything else in this game's design feels so intelligently laid out, I'm almost certain that if Rose Engine thought this would have fit the game, they probably would have implemented this long before anyone could have even complained about it. I am quite apathetic about this issue at this point, but I do agree with the community that it can feel like a little bit too much. It depends on who's playing it though. It does add a layer of stress in terms of decision making, but it can also ruin the pacing if the player ends up frustrated. I wouldn't say this was the wrong choice though. Looking at the silver lining here, a crowded inventory space can be a good problem to have, as that means the game gives you plenty of resources and an incentive to backtrack. On both normal and survival mode, you can end up swimming in resources if you play it right, but the enemies work in a way that could potentially result in a player depleting all of their resources. Signalis has a mechanic that works just like in RE1 Remake, where creatures get back up and you need to burn the corpses before they reanimate. Resident Evil's solution was kerosene and a lighter, and in Signalis the solution is thermite and flares. The difference is that in Signalis they don't just reanimate the one time, they do it over and over and over as if they're stuck in an endless loop. Who knows, maybe they are. Most of the level design consists of tight corridors or boxed rooms with plenty of obstacles such as furniture and debris, and if you are unfortunate enough to get stuck on a puzzle and not understand how parrying works and end up using all your resources to be able to get around and forget to save, you're screwed. Saving manually is a staple of traditional horror games, so make sure you do it as frequently as possible. One thing you should know about Signalis is that it is heavy on lore, and reading is a key part of this experience. I've seen plenty of complaints about the excessive reading, but as someone who likes to keep reading as a separate hobby from video games, I will 100% stand behind the decision of making the text the predominant form of communication in Signalis. Usually I'd rather listen to an audio log as long as I can freely move around, but given the story implications in Signalis, the use of audio logs would actually hurt the credibility of the story. Signalis is a video game at the end of the day, but make no mistake, the text is absolutely mystifying and even transfixing to read. On several occasions in Signalis, you stumble upon a book called The King in Yellow, which is based on a real 20th century book of the same name by author Robert W. Chambers. The King in Yellow is a collection of cosmic and psychological horror short stories about a written play that goes by the same name. I've never read the book, but it seems that whoever reads the play ends up succumbing to madness or has a life-changing revelation that leaves them permanently feeling hollow or haunted. I bring this up now instead of later in the video because most, if not all, of the readable text in the game captures that feeling to a large degree. The game lifts excerpts straight out of The King in Yellow and even from some notable works of H.P. Lovecraft, but it also offers a ton of notes, lore, and environmental storytelling that feels just as haunting. Story implications notwithstanding, the advantage of text over audio logs in Signalis is the deafening silence that comes with reading it, as you slowly work your way through a cryptic text and the revelation of something sinister explodes unceremoniously, like a scream in outer space where the horror does leave your mouth but can only be heard in the corridors of your mind. This is some of the strongest video game writing and characterization I've ever seen. Every character and every author of every note has a unique personality and an emotional, existential turmoil that effortlessly jumps out of the page. Signalis could easily be a spine-chilling novel. The last gameplay mechanic is the most interesting one, which is why I've saved it for last. Much like the text you read, the radio module is just as narratively and thematically relevant, but it also adds another dimension to the gameplay. No pun intended. Or was it? The radio has been a staple of horror for a long time, but in Signalis it isn't just a radio. It is the message at the heart of it all. It is a device, a tool, a conduit, a storyteller, a weapon, and a metaphor. It is both the question and the answer to everything and nothing. It is the glue that holds this universe together. Gameplay-wise, it works more like the codec in Metal Gear Solid than an actual radio in Silent Hill, even though it still functions as a conduit between reality and other dimensions. Depending on the situation, you have to tune into specific frequencies. To explain how it works, I'll have to go over the premise with you. The game takes place on several planets within a colonized solar system set in a distant future. The lore talks about two factions going at each other's throats. You have Yusan, also known as the Nation, and then there's the Empire. The Sierpinski facility where you start out from is owned by Eon, an institution that aids the Nation in the ongoing war against the Empire. It is a distant, dystopian future, one that is quite Orwellian in nature, and so everyone resorts to communication via pen and paper or by sending cryptic messages hidden within specific radio frequencies. The existence of an eidetic module is symbolic of the Orwellian nature of this society, and other more abstract things we'll cover later. This is a totalitarian society hell-bent on suppressing thoughts, emotions, and individual artistic expression. Should any text that does not align with the interests of the nation be discovered, it can lead to dire consequences, which is why most of the text that you read is either as cryptic or as well hidden as the messages in the radio themselves. You will almost never find a code or a password in the same room as the puzzle itself. I say almost because there is one exception where a puzzle is spelled out overtly to the player, but the reason it is spelled out is that the puzzle is so bewildering it risks breaking the flow and stopping the pacing dead in its tracks. But that is the exception. You have to put in the work for everything in Signalis. You gotta dig deep, read between the lines, and earn the story. This is why text in Signalis helps give the story credibility. It is smart game design, it is smart environmental storytelling, and it does not hold your hand. It kills 3 birds with 1 frequency. Speaking of killing birds with 1 frequency, the enemies are all replicas just like Elster, and each type of replica is named after a bird, also just like Elster. The name of each replica is in German and translates to the names of specific birds. There's Ara, a macaw, Storch, a stork, Sta, a starling, Mina, a bird that also belongs to the starling family, Colibri, a hummingbird, Oila, an owl. Much like the birds in the wilderness, the replicas are named according to hierarchy, occupation, and personality traits. At the top of the food chain is the ultimate replica, Falke, a falcon, and a second in command called Adla, the eagle. When I said killing 3 birds with 1 frequency, it wasn't only a figure of speech, but a literal game mechanic when it comes to the Colibri units in particular. It's no coincidence that they'd be named after a hummingbird. A hummingbird's wings flap so fast they make a buzzing noise, almost like a fly. The sound is eerily similar to radio static, almost as if they're humming to the song of life, the song of the universe. I wouldn't be surprised if some of the static in the game is an audio sample of a hummingbird's wings, because frankly, when I looked these birds up on YouTube, the sound immediately reminded me of the buzzing noise heard throughout most of the technology used in Signalis. It is quite fitting then that the key to defeating the Colibris is to use their own tools against them. You don't need to shoot the Colibri like the other replicas, you can just neutralize them with the radio. I'm aware that the word neutralize has become some sort of soft language for the word kill, but in Signalis, a neutralizing frequency is just as deadly as any other weapon, and I suspect it's even worse. The Colibri have a soft spot for things with artistic value. They enjoy music and especially paintings. Whenever you encounter Colibri, you are bound to find the source of what drove them mad in that same room. If you look around, there's bound to be a painting. Something about paintings disrupts their neural patterns and they spiral out of control and transmit harmful frequencies. If you're wondering what a neural pattern is, it's sort of like genetic memory passed down to a replica from their human ancestor. If by any chance you've watched the movie Blade Runner 2049, you already know what I'm getting at. Replicas toe the line between human and robot, between technology and biology, and between reality and dreams. They share the same memories, personality, temperament, and flaws with the same human being they were modeled after, dead or alive, unable to distinguish where their ancestors' original characteristics end and their distinctly newly formed ones begin, if at all. Elster uses the radio to transmit opposing frequencies of her own, frequencies that quite literally neutralize the Colibri. The frequencies cancel each other out and the Colibri's madness and suffering stops. It's like a math problem where -1 + 1 = 0, dissolving into nothing. Colibris are the only ones that seem to permanently exit this never-ending loop of a nightmare. Everything in this world seems to divide by 0. If you do that on a calculator, the answer is infinite, forever undefined and incomprehensible, inexistent. Elster fights the Colibri by doing the opposite. The Colibri's frequency multiplies, creating copies of themselves, whereas Elster's frequency divides, shattering their illusion and breaking the facade. The LSTR-512 replica we take control of is Elsta, a magpie. What's interesting about Elster is that she is an oddity. Unlike the other replicas, Elster does not specialize in any particular skill. She is a scout unit, a jack of all trades and a master of none. You can't put a label on who she is and what defines her. She fits nowhere and everywhere all at once. Magpies are well known for being some of the smartest birds in existence, which makes them resourceful. Not only does this make Elster the perfect survivalist, but also the perfect protagonist for this story. She is an unstoppable force meeting an immovable object. As to what that immovable object is, we'll put a rain check on it for now. In summary, the gameplay is tight. It's got a few blemishes, the inventory might rub some people the wrong way. Personally for me though, my only small gripes with the gameplay are the unreliable door opening prompts. They're unpredictable and I've had instances where I literally died and lost progress because of this issue, and the other gripe is the stomp. If you had to ask me which horror game should allow you to stomp enemies, I'd probably just reply with a yes. Unfortunately, SIGNALIS only gets one tiny thing wrong about the stomp, and that is the animation speed. It lacks weight and there's no momentum to it. If it could have slowed down the animation by just a few notches and give it a little bit better readability, it could have been awesome. But overall, what really matters is that the gameplay loop is excellent. It's a great selling point for die-hard fans of the classical survival horror style. Personally, I'm more of a moment-to-moment precision aiming kind of survival horror player. I tend to like the modernized gameplay loops a bit more, and even though I consider the gameplay to be the least compelling part of SIGNALIS, it was more than enough to keep me fulfilled, even after the 5 or 6 playthroughs that I've completed so far. But trust me, we're just getting started. There are far more interesting things about SIGNALIS we haven't talked about yet. Within the span of just 8 weeks, we were able to get our hands on 2 of the most photorealistic sci-fi horror games in the history of gaming. The Dead Space remake took what made the original's aesthetic so timeless and gave it a refurbishment that, while we hope will also stand the test of time, there's no guarantee that it will. The Callisto Protocol, on the other hand, has a relatively less cohesive art style, but pushes photorealism to a point where even on PS4 it gives the Dead Space remake on PS5 a run for its money. Opinions on the two are most certainly polarizing, but we can all agree that both games are an absolute feast for the eyes. Then there's SIGNALIS, which couldn't be any more graphically different in terms of its style. It isn't photorealistic in the slightest. Instead, it does something far more interesting with far less. SIGNALIS looks unrealistic by design. The art style and direction is spellbinding, visually striking, and depressingly jaw-dropping. It is a game that looks and feels both beautiful and wrong in all the right places, doing everything in its power to give you, well, mixed signals. These puns just write themselves, don't they? SIGNALIS immediately stands out for its mixture of 2 very niche art styles in video games, sci-fi anime and PlayStation 1 low-poly horror. It sounds like a weird combination that on paper shouldn't work, but while it definitely is weird, it also definitely works. On the surface, SIGNALIS gives the typical indie impression of a 2D pixel art game, but it's actually a 3D game that is seen in 2.5D through the use of an elevated tracking camera. When I made the comparison to Cubism at the beginning of this video, I intended for it to circle back to the specific chapter. The low-poly aesthetic works in favor of SIGNALIS' ambiguous, multifaceted story. Much like the shapes in Cubism, the retro low-poly aesthetic keeps you in the dark when it comes to highly specific details, yet it provides just enough information for you to fill in the gaps on your own. In cutscenes you can barely see the eyes and mouth on the in-game character models, but then it's all juxtaposed with hand-drawn anime poses full of life and expressive detail, and what's fascinating is how it all comes together. SIGNALIS' art direction is so particular and so unmistakable that the back and forth shift between anime drawings and low-poly models feels unnaturally natural. I am aware of the heavy usage of oxymorons and paradoxes in this video, but I really can't stress enough how important this is within the context of SIGNALIS. The game is deliberately built on contradictions. Paradoxes and memories are essential themes in SIGNALIS. Memories of replicas clash and interfere with memories of their previous lives as gestalts, and even memories that never were. Technology in SIGNALIS falls under the retro-tech aesthetic, like in Ridley Scott's Alien, where the function is somehow advanced enough for society to explore beyond the limits of the solar system, yet the form and design has stagnated and plateaued to a time and a generation that even by today's standards is extremely outdated. Even in just the level design, you'll start to notice repeating patterns. New locations mirror old ones, characters you come across resemble others you've already met, the cinematography of certain cutscenes are perfectly mirrored, using the same camera angles, the same poses, same actions, as if the inhabitants of this world are stuck in parallel universes, forever repeating each other's actions but through different places and different people. Each character's timeline is fragmented and it never tells the whole story. It is only when all the timelines are superimposed on top of each other like film reels spliced together and overlaid in a full-blown projection that you start to get somewhere. Towards the end, the game introduces us to the concept of pareidolia, and it does so by making it integral to one of the puzzles. You ever look at some weird, random object like an electrical socket and your mind starts to imagine a smiley face coming out of the pinholes? Or maybe you've seen a video of a cloud where you could swear you saw the face of a religious figure. Maybe you looked at a painting of a landscape and the shape of a face slowly started to emerge. That is pareidolia. It is the phenomenon of being able to recognize patterns and make out shapes from the simplest, most random objects you could find. Pareidolia is at the heart of Signalis' open-endedness. It is the driving force behind the overall aesthetic, and it has more narrative relevance than one might notice at face value. Much like the themes of memories and paradoxes, the theme of pareidolia is one of prominence, and you will start to notice it on subsequent playthroughs. The game does tons of other cool things to mess with your head. Enemies have that bone-chilling, jittery, stuttery shiver when they stand idle. Other times they're just slowly patrolling large corridors and their looming shadow just creeps in towards you from the edge of the screen. Their character models can even do a fourth wall-breaking glitch, with a bunch of pixelated shapes flashing on the screen as if enemies are zoning in and out of reality like some glitch in the Matrix. The game has some other interesting screen effects too. You can toggle a graphics option in the menu to make the game look even more old school, similar to how it would have looked back in the day of a CRT monitor. The picture quality gets blurrier, the colors get smudgier, there's chromatic aberrations and curved lines everywhere, and now I suddenly feel old. Just kidding. Or am I? As with lots of other stuff in this game, it's one of those things that you won't really use, but it's always nice to have that there as an option. I did do one of the playthroughs using this setting. It's a little bit disorienting, although I got used to it pretty fast, but it's not gonna be for me. You know what is for me though? That inventory menu. I dig this thing. It's a cool mix between the classic Silent Hill interface blended with the item box management of Resident Evil, and then on top they've given it this clean, rectangular, minimalistic design to the item slots and the radio menu that pay a nice little homage to Metal Gear Solid. Also, can we just stop for a moment to appreciate how Signalis manages to stand out so well, despite all the inspirations it wears on its sleeve? Seriously, just take one look at Elster and tell me that's not an iconic look. It's a simple red and black combination, yet it is so instantly recognizable. You could post Elster fan art on Twitter that is on par with a stick figure drawing, and you can still tell who it is just from the red chestplate and the short black hair. The branding game is super on point here. I'm not that much of an anime manga follower. I've only really watched Death Note and Another, but those of you who really love this stuff, you've obviously noticed the resemblance to Blom, Ergo Proxy, and Ghost in the Shell from a mile away, and it's a really cool aesthetic. I have spent an absurd amount of time staring at the shiny graphics of Callisto Protocol and Dead Space, but at the end of the day, it is the imagery of Signalis that will for sure continue to live rent-free in my mind. But even then, visuals only tell a fraction of the whole story. The sound in Signalis is like a mermaid calling to a ship that is doomed to sink. It draws you in closer and closer, and it sounds like the end. The end of the road, the end of the universe, the end of a dream. It takes me back to melancholic mornings sitting by the bus window, staring at the fog over the coastline and contemplating life. It's that whiplash of feeling anchored to social anxiety and yet feeling like floating through the incessant daydreams, pulling you further and further down the rabbit hole. I can't compliment the sound in Signalis enough. It doesn't emphasize diegetic sound as much as some other horror titles, but the full package of a dreamlike soundtrack mixed with the punchy and crunchy sound effects creates an outstanding tone and atmosphere. From the crescendo of flare guns and thermites corroding through the replicas, to the frying sound of stun prods burning them to a crisp, to them screaming and screeching the second they hear you running. Scrolling through items and combining them produces this satisfying, high-pitched bleep that harkens back to Metal Gear Solid as much as the aesthetic itself does. Every single computer, door, puzzle object, and item box produces an air-puncturing sound that keeps this lizard brain of mine entertained, and yet none of these sounds hold a candle to Elster's arsenal. Wanna know what sounds even better? The reload. God, those bullet casings and shells are like ASMR. The way they hit the ground and clink is just perfect. Do you want to know what somehow sounds even better than that? The soundtrack. Video games have never been a stranger to killer soundtracks over the past few decades, but it's not often you get a game where you are inclined to listen to the soundtrack from front to back like a normal music album. I usually go back to a few select tracks from a few select games when I get nostalgic, but there are other times, like with Silent Hill 2, that I just end up binging the whole track list. Aside from a few Resident Evil games and Mick Gordon's bangers in the last couple of Doom games, and even Stray, the cat game that took over the internet last year, it's not often I get to listen to a soundtrack that is just consistently top quality from start to finish. I'm happy to say that the Signalis soundtrack immediately slingshotted itself up there on the same music shelf at the very top. In total, there are 56 music tracks spread out between two co-composers, Cicada Sirens and 1000 Eyes. Although there are some clear exceptions, most of the 19 tracks by Cicada Sirens gravitate towards feelings of retrospection, calmness, and melancholy. On the other hand, most of the 37 other tracks by 1000 Eyes tend to be a lot more frenetic and chaotic, honing in on characteristics such as industrial horror and the more immediate survival aspect. There is no voice acting in Signalis, which is both a common and reasonable practice in the indie space. It is always understandable to want to cut these type of costs, but it's even more remarkable when a developer not only cuts these costs, but uses these limitations to their advantage. Characters can still have a strong sense of individuality and a voice purely from a writing standpoint, but when you have characters like in Signalis that are no more well informed of their surroundings and happenings than the player does, it's hard to give the world itself a voice of its own. The music more than makes up for it, and it carries and resonates exactly what each and every one of us, both off-screen and on-screen, feel about the experience that the game provides. One minute, you're accompanied by strings that pumps your arduous journey full of excitement and intrigue. The next, you are teleported to a bathroom where Elster just gives a blank stare at the mirror. Her expressions are elusive, but the eerie and dreamlike music narrows those feelings down to a sense of longing and hope for something we quite don't know what it is yet. The world around her starts crumbling not long after, and you are bombarded by clash of metal and other unsettling sounds that reflect the state of mind of the replicas that have inexplicably been corrupted from the inside out. You keep getting transported to different places, to mountains and shorelines and worldly wonders of impossible geometry, and yet the music that accompanies them sounds almost exactly as the feelings you'd expect to feel when you look at them. Serene, worried, small, special, insignificant, awestruck, temporary, in harmony with the universe, and shivering at the thought of how little you know and understand what's around you, and how little you know and understand what's going on in Signalis. And that is the beauty of it. And with that, the Raven draws to a conclusion. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see... Did
you really think we were done? Aren't you forgetting something? Don't you know why you're here? Why all of this keeps happening? You're gone, but you never left. Do you remember your promise? It is time to face the truth.
Wake up. If you're still here after that small little fake out, I appreciate you sticking around. From here onwards, I'd like to talk about what I think is happening in SIGNALIS. Everything so far has been semi-spoiler territory, but there will be full spoilers ahead. If you haven't played the game, go ahead and play it first. This game's worth every single penny. You won't find a AAA horror game with a story nearly as good for triple the price. If you have played the game, here's what I want you to do. I want you to go down in the comments section and tell me what you think happened in SIGNALIS. It doesn't matter if it's off or if it's spot on, I just want to know what you took away from the experience and how it affected you. Let me know down below. I look forward to what you guys have to say. Without further ado, let's begin. SIGNALIS is purposely designed to leave many gaps open for interpretation, there's no questioning that. No matter from which angle you approach the narrative, you are bound to find a piece of the picture that is misaligned with the rest of what seems to be a plausible explanation. You might reinterpret it from an entirely different and equally plausible angle, and then you're left with a different misalignment somewhere else. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't a one true story to SIGNALIS. It might exist for all we know, but the creators have most likely removed a few conclusive details, a few blocks from this massive Jenga tower of a complex narrative in order for the puzzle to never be fully solved. A key component to the narrative that is missing is a full understanding of the concept of bioresonance. We know that most of society and technology in the solar system has had a massive boost ever since they've discovered how to use it, but that they have also stagnated because they still don't fully understand how it works or why it works the way that it does. Only a select few are gifted enough with the ability to comprehend it, and an even lesser few are capable of manipulating it and bending it to their will. The Empress is documented to have been one such gifted person, and at the tail end of the game it is revealed that Ariane holds the same exact gift, even if she doesn't know it. It paints the Empress and Ariane as important figures wielding psychic powers, but I think the answer is much less dramatic than that, yet much more profound. I look at bioresonance as something abstract and metaphorical, not to be taken in a literal sense. I don't think it's a psychic ability as many have described it. I'm convinced it's an allegory to something that is deeply rooted in the human condition, and that something is art. Art is more than just a painting in a museum, it is more than a prestigious film that wins countless awards, and it is more than a video game that does something innovative. It's not a physical, tangible object. Art is an abstract language in which we convey ideas and feelings for which no amount of words can ever fully articulate. We can all talk to someone and tell them how we feel about something, but it is only when one expresses their feelings through their art that the other person can truly get the deepest, darkest sense of the sorrow, frustration, or even joy and euphoria that the person communicating through their art truly feels. It is the act of showing, not telling. It is why such a rule is sacred when it comes to creative writing, for example. Art has been with us since the primitive days, before humans could even learn to verbally communicate. It is believed that art might even be the tool that helped humans develop speech to begin with. Art was the first means of communication we discovered because it is the most intuitive one, the one we're all born with, but not necessarily one that we all know how to use. To understand art is to understand the world around us. The meaning of life, the meaning of death, of the universe, and why anything even exists. Art might also be as intuitive as it is to us because it also exists on a micro level. We're all just a bunch of atoms and molecules arranged in a particular way, sending out vibrations, constantly imposing and transmitting our existence onto everything that surrounds us. We're consistently doing everything we can to leave our mark on the world. Perhaps art in its truest and simplest essence is a pure frequency residing at the core of the human condition, forever sending out a transmission to those who are willing to listen and decipher it, forever searching for a way to leave its indelible mark. Ariane grew up surrounded by works of art in a world where art is suppressed, controlled, and even banned, in a world conquered by the nation. Most likely, the Empress would have had the same privileges as Ariane, if not significantly more, to enjoy and interact with the art that she consumed. They are both well versed in art, which makes them more in tune with the frequency at the heart of everything that exists. This seems to be the mutual link between the Empress and Ariane. This, I believe, is bioresonance. Bioresonance in SIGNALIS is clearly what one would call a MacGuffin. For those who don't know, a MacGuffin is an object of interest to the characters within a story and an object of curiosity to the viewer. The object is usually a something a character or a group of characters want to ultimately obtain. It is a goal that drives characters to move forward to it and by proxy drives the story forward. An example of a classic MacGuffin that always springs to mind is the briefcase from the 1994 film Pulp Fiction. The contents of the briefcase were never specified, and you are most likely to find ongoing speculations to this day. Now technically we do know what was in the briefcase while the cameras were rolling. Some have speculated that the golden glow emitting from the case was a pile of gold. Others have speculated that it is the soul of Vincent's boss and employer, Marcellus Wallace. I won't get into the specifics about that one. It's one of the best movies ever made. Go watch it. I'm about to spoil what was in that briefcase, so if you haven't watched the movie yet, please skip to this time code. It was a light bulb. There is a point to all this. It should go without saying that the light bulb is just a prop. It's there to create the golden hue, nothing more, nothing less. It's not meant to be a satisfying answer in terms of the story that Pulp Fiction is trying to tell. It tells us what was used in the filmmaking process to fabricate the mystery around the briefcase, but it doesn't solve the mystery itself. There is a reason why Quentin Tarantino never answered what was in that briefcase, and it's that if there were to be an objective singular answer, it will never live up to the answer you've created in your head. The same applies for the MacGuffins in Signalis. It's the lack of conclusive answers that will keep the discussion around this game alive for the years to come. But what's interesting about this particular MacGuffin in Signalis is that it's not a prop for the story, but a philosophical question that transcends the game. I want you to hold on to that thought because I want to jump straight into my interpretation of the story in Signalis. Let's address the big elephant in the room first. Is Signalis actually real, or is it a dream? This is a question I started asking myself 25% of the way in through my first playthrough all the way up till now as I'm writing this review. And I'm sure many of you have wondered the same thing. However, I think this is a good question presented in a flawed way. The problem is that it's a clear-cut question to a story that simply does not deal in absolutes. I'll give you the simple answer first. What happens in most of Signalis is not real. At least if you ask me, I have no doubt that most of it is a dream. If you're not convinced, I invite you to go to the publisher Humble Games YouTube channel and read the title of the trailer for yourself. Signalis is advertised as a dream about dreaming. Here's why I believe this to be true. If a publisher were to rely on dishonest marketing, it would be done in self-interest, in the interest of boosting sales. For example, if you wanted to hide a shady monetization tactic, you would do everything in your power to dodge the questions surrounding that feature and talk more about the things that consumers want to hear. In the case of Signalis, you could look at that title and think it's a reductive description, but I have to wonder, what does Humble Games stand to gain from this if this were to be true? Why would Signalis, an indie title competing in the often overlooked niche that is the retro survival horror space, put the words "a dream about dreaming" as their main slogan? What would it exactly accomplish if it was dishonest, beyond alienating what is already a small target audience? It would seem to me that a publisher catering to an audience this highly specific would do everything in its power to tell you exactly what it is trying to get you to buy, even if perhaps against the wishes of the developers. A debut indie title that is this nuanced and obscure benefits more from a simple high-concept pitch than a needlessly complicated one. There's no incentive to speak in riddles about what the story is when the story already is enigmatic as is, even with some clarity. So ultimately, yes, I do believe that Signalis is actually, unironically, a dream about dreaming. Now for the more complicated answer. Signalis is definitely a dream, but it's not just a dream. You've seen this cliche play out at some point in whatever form of media you consume. It doesn't matter if the story is from a book, a television show, a movie, or even other video games. You reach the end, the character wakes up, and it all gets shrugged off, and it was all for nothing. It was just a dream. It's perfectly normal to reject a dream hypothesis in Signalis because we have been taught and conditioned to despise such an answer whenever it is presented to us. It's the classic Pavlovian response, and it is to be expected. A story needs to have consequences for it to mean something, and nothing invalidates consequences like a dream where you just wake up, take everything for granted, and learn absolutely nothing. But that's not what's happening in Signalis now, is it? Most of what you see in it is indeed a dream, but it's not using the dream to escape the consequences. It's an honest-to-God smart subversion of expectations and reframes the idea of how dreams can be intelligently used to tell a phenomenal story. In Signalis, the dream isn't an escape from consequences, it is the consequence that needs escaping from. This is not an ordinary dream. I believe Signalis has not one dream, not two, but three. Three separate dreams converging into one single dream so lucid and powerful that it's now far more real than reality itself. Let's break down what happens at the end. There are 4 endings in Signalis. The first 3 of them are considered normal endings. In all 3 of these endings, you have to face Falca as the final boss. What do we know about Falca? Falca is the most powerful bioresonant replica there is. She is, in the nation's eyes, a superhuman if there ever was one. She is a perfect mirror of Aerion's unknown powers. Both are depicted as nearly identical in cutscenes, and even the imagery of them lying on a bed is the exact same. For those who don't know, both Falca and Aerion have their own dedicated theme in the soundtrack. That's not the interesting part. The interesting part is that Falca's theme is Aerion's theme played backwards. This is no coincidence. Falca not having her own particular theme aligns perfectly with her eventual loss of identity. Falca's theme being Aerion's theme in reverse conveys the idea that Aerion is transmitting her own memories, slowly overwriting and replacing Falca's true memories like some sort of malware corrupting and overwriting a computer's disk drive against its will. The music player that Falca holds in her sleep seems to support and strengthen this theory. You probably heard the music coming out of this speaker at some point in real life. It is a Russian classical ballet called Swan Lake. Swan Lake is a tragic love story about a prince named Siegfried and a woman named Odette. An evil sorcerer had placed a curse on Odette, transforming her into a swan and can only revert back to human form at night. The evil sorcerer of the tale, Rothbart, is described as owl-like. Sounds awfully familiar, don't you think? It was Prince Siegfried's birthday, and he celebrated by going out hunting for a bevy of swans. One of those swans was Odette, and she transformed into a beautiful woman right before his eyes. She reveals to him that the spell can only be broken if one who has never loved before swears to love her forever. Siegfried, bewitched by her beauty, swears to break the curse. However, the sorcerer ends up deceiving him by transforming his own daughter, Odile, into looking exactly like Odette. Having mistakenly sworn his love to the wrong woman, a tragic end was set in stone. And even though Odette forgives him in the end, she loses all hope and jumps into the lake. Siegfried, wanting to be with her forever, does the same. This final choice, both ironically and tragically, ends up breaking the curse, and the sorcerer dies along with it. The Swan Lake Ballet is a crystal clear parallel to Signalis. Falca is Odette, and whatever entity she came across in the mines is the sorcerer's equivalent. Adler is obviously the Prince Siegfried, a foolish man too busy being head over heels in love with Falca to realize that the dream is deceiving him. We'll talk more about this later. Signalis is a Latin word for signal. A transmission isn't just something that occurs in some parts of the game, it is the whole game. So, my claim is that there are 3 dreams in Signalis. You with me so far? Okay, now I want you to think of Signalis as a triangle, and here's why. Believe it or not, triangles in Signalis are just as prominent as the rule of 6. For example, in Elster's diagnostics menu next to the radio and the files, there are 16 triangles on display. If Elster dies 16 times throughout a playthrough, those triangles will all light up and they lead you to the promised ending. Quick note, if you stack 16 equilateral triangles on top of each other, you actually create another, even bigger triangle. If this happens to look familiar, it's because you've seen a symbol with the same triangles in the game. On the cover of The King in Yellow and throughout various locations, you see a set of 3 symbols looking like diamonds or stars. These 3 shapes represent the 3 hosts of the dream. the 3 different signals that are being sent back and forth to sustain the one big giant dream that's made up of their separate smaller dreams. The first of the 3 dreamers is obviously Ariane. Signalis is a dream, but like all dreams, they are somewhat rooted in reality. For example, everything that happens up until the Penrose crash landing is actually real. That is the catalyst, that's what started the dream. If you try to piece the story together in a linear fashion, that is the inciting incident. Ariane had signed up for the Penrose program to get away from everything in her life, and in doing so, she fell in love with her scout replica assistant on board the Penrose, Elster. After a certain number of cycles on the Penrose, where one cycle is assumed to equal 1 day, the Penrose ship would eventually break down and cease to protect Ariane and Elster from possible radiation. For situations like this, the nation had advised Ariane that no help will be sent, advising her to request a mercy killing from her replica that could spare a human and fragile gestalt such as herself from a slow death. Unfortunately, this plan was never fulfilled because Elster actually died before Ariane. Right at the end, the Elster we've been playing as comes across her own corpse and confesses that she could not keep her promise to Ariane. Whether or not Elster died prematurely due to her robotic properties succumbing faster to the radiation than a human like Ariane would, or if Elster actually took quite a while to die but never had the guts to end Ariane's suffering in the cryo chamber, that is unclear. It's left open-ended, but I do find the latter scenario to be more likely. Because of this tragic outcome, Ariane becomes stuck in cryo chamber limbo, forever dying from radiation and yet forever surviving in cryostasis. She's trapped in neither here nor there, or in other words, nowhere. Ariane is bioresonant, and so her dreams inside the cryo chamber are so powerful and lucid that she ends up creating her own reality inside the dream. She is the creator, the host, the I of the dream. In a completely different part of the universe, the Sierpinski workers discover something deep within the mines, deep within the bowels of the planet Leng. An infinite red desert and a gate where everything beyond it is unknown. The Commander Falke, being the respected, all-wise and all-powerful leader, is the first person to cross that threshold. Whatever she finds in the beyond causes her to go mad and traps her in a state of limbo, the same as Ariane, forever confined to her bedroom on the 8th floor of the mining facility, like the swan Odette confined to a lake. Just like Ariane, who has been tainted by radiation, Falke has been tainted by Ariane's dream that reached Falke through bioresonance. And also just like Ariane, she never wakes up from her slumber, and yet she never dies. Everyone working at the facility, including Adler, are left hopeless and bewildered with the lack of answers. No one knows what happened to Falke, no one knows what she saw, and no one knows what lies beyond the gate. No one knows and understands the true horror that resides deep within the mines. A secret 4th ending reveals the existence of an artifact, one which Elster inexplicably has in her possession and uses it to create some sort of ritual. This is the only ending in Signalis to not end in a final showdown between Elster and Falke. The nature of this artifact is unknown. It could be a real physical object, it could be an illusion, or a horrifying shape-shifting eldritch god, but whatever the hell this is, no pun intended, it is definitely another MacGuffin. And it's safe to say that it is the literal or metaphorical entity that Commander Falke encountered in the mines. There's a probability that there's only one MacGuffin in Signalis that is appearing in 2 places at once, functioning like some sort of portal, which would make sense given that there's a depiction of a gate in both the Red Desert and in the snow beyond the Penrose. So far we've uncovered 2 of the 3 dreamers, Ariane and Falke, which brings us to the ultimate question: who is the third? When it comes to signals, there's something that is known as triangulation. This is often seen in both real life and mostly action spy thrillers, where organizations track down mysterious phone calls. These organizations or agencies will tell the person in distress to answer the call and keep whoever's on the other end talking, so that the organization can trace and pinpoint where the call is coming from. This creates two entry points in the transmission between the caller and the receiver, and a third entity, the agency, can be the third entry point, which forms a triangle which is then used to locate the source of the call, the source of the signal. That is triangulation. In this case, Ariane is the caller and Falca is the receiver. The third dreamer in this transmission, the triangulator and the one whose actions will determine the fate of this dream loop, is Elster. It is speculated that when a person dies, the brain experiences one final dream. A near-death experience is usually described as your whole life flashing before your eyes, but it is said that upon death, this dream can feel like an eternity. I am of the belief that this is exactly what Elster is experiencing throughout the game. It's true that both dreams of Ariane and Falca are stuck in a loop, but in Elster's case, it is just the one dream. It just so happens to feel as endless, even if in her case, it is not. This is where, when, and how the events of Signalis take place. There is a recurring theme in science fiction concerning robots and humans called transhumanism. It asks philosophical questions about identity and change. This is a thought experiment known as the Ship of Theseus. The Ship of Theseus asks a simple question that has no definitive answer. So let's say there's a ship, right? And eventually it replaces most, if not all, of its original parts with new parts. This is all well and good, but it raises an important and paradoxical question. Is it now a different ship, or is it still the same ship? The theme of transhumanism in science fiction poses the same exact question about robots and humans. If a human being was to eventually swap every single body part with a cybernetic part, is the human that once was really still there, or is a robot all that is left? And conversely, if a robot was to evolve into something that is indistinguishable from a human being, is it still a robot, or has the robot become human? The lines blur further and further, unable to tell where the android ends and the person begins. Do androids dream of electric sheep? Dream. The Ship of Theseus is a question that Signalis is obsessed with. The question is not just about androids and people, it is an endless rabbit hole. Right before Elster confronts Falca, she picks up one last note. Here's what it says. A crashed ship, a strange gate, a hole in the ground, an island beyond reach, memories from other lives, dreams of suffering and loneliness, a promise, a search for someone lost. I saw her in the red emptiness, waiting for me. We had made a promise. As the memories of a stranger rushed into my mind, I felt the borders of myself blur. Now, I can no longer tell where Falk ends and Elster begins. When Elster dies 16 times, you unlock a trophy. I do not know how to pronounce it in German, but it translates to the word hole. Every hole that Elster jumps into or crawls through is another gap, another missing piece of the story. No matter which way you look at a cube, you can only see 3 sides of its story. Cubism, or the rule of 6, the 6 sides of a cube that can never be simultaneously visible. The description of that trophy only says, the Ship of Theseus. This thought experiment goes beyond Falca and Elster. All the different places you visit bleed into one another. Would you be able to tell where Penrose ends and Sierpinski begins? Would you be able to tell where the school ends and Rotfront begins? They are just like the paintings that Elster sees in her dying visions. The Isle of the Dead. A part of it changes from one painting to the next, and even though you can tell something is different, it still feels like the same place, the same painting. Can you tell where one island ends and the other begins? Can you tell where Ariane's dream ends and Falk's begins? Can you tell where Falk's dream ends and Elster's begins? Can you tell where Ariane's dream ends and Elster's begins? Signalis is a story about so many things, but ultimately it is a story about the human condition. It's about the question that all of us have to face. What lies beyond death? Ariane and Falca sit on their deathbeds, dreaming a dream about the afterlife. A dream so lucid it becomes more real than reality itself. Through bioresonance it can almost reach the afterlife, but the signal can only reach as far as limbo. the place of nothingness, nowhere, the place where Elster currently is. The map does not work in nowhere, because nowhere does not exist. It only exists within. Arion and Falca use the power of the bioresonance to reach Elster, as she knows the answers that lie beyond the gate. This gives Elster, a replica with lesser bioresonance powers than the two of them, absolute power over the dream. With the keys of the kingdom handed to her, she is destined to become the god of the dream. Reality does not exist. It is a lie. The Sierpinski workers never turned into mindless monsters, Rotfront was never consumed by eldritch horrors and tumors, and Arion's ship never crashed back on Leng. The idea of the nation recovering Elster's unit is nothing more than a distortion of reality, delusion, because the nation, a governing entity where even a single bullet never goes to waste, would never approve funding for a second ship just to go on a voyage doomed with the same fate should it ever attempt to salvage anything left from the Penrose. Here is what's really going on. When Elster wakes up for the first time on the Penrose, it is the first cycle of the dream where both Arion's and Falca's dreams collide with hers. Her memories of a fully functioning Penrose turns into the snowy deserts of Leng from Falca's dream, which then turns into the bedroom on Rotfront from Arion's dream. In this room, Elster is faced with 3 facts about her situation. The first fact is revealed to her through The King in Yellow, a book that both Arion and Falca have read at some point in their lives, and so through both of their memories, the book has made its way into the dream. Upon opening and reading the book, it tells her a truth that changes her forever. Elster is dead. The second fact is revealed when the radio station turns on by itself. Arion, who grew up working at a radio outpost, is reaching out through the radio, establishing contact with Elster beyond the grave. But Elster does not remember who Arion is, at least not yet. She remembers her promise, but not to whom. The third fact is revealed when she finds the safe with 3 padlocks. These padlocks can only be unlocked when Elster, the triangulator of the dream, locates the source of every dreamer. With this revelation, she gains a new perspective. Her face melts away before our very eyes. Elster no longer wears a mask, and now she hates everything. She battles her way through the jumbled memories of the other dreamers and finally takes control by arriving at her true location, nowhere. She finds Adler sitting in front of the gate, scared and afraid of crossing over. He ponders over what lies ahead, and when he asks Elster about what's beyond the gate, she simply tells him it doesn't matter. When she steps beyond the gate, she sees corpses of herself strewn about all over the desert, reminding her of all the times she's failed to end the cycle. But this particular Elster, the one who's become sentient in this dream, is both all of these dead Elsters and yet none of them all at once. These are not clones sent from elsewhere. They're not real. The only real Elster is the one we are playing as right now, the ghost in the machine, hell-bent on making things right. She climbs aboard the Penrose and fails one last time, because her promise has been misguided. Up to this point, she had it all mixed up. Elster's neural pattern comes from a Venetan soldier named Lilith Ito. All this time, she thought she was Lilith, looking for Alina So. Alina, however, never worked in Sierpinski, and she never went into the mines. Arion had remarked on how she looked just like Alina, and she wondered how her life would have turned out if she were in her shoes, confusing where Arion ends and Alina begins. Elster, too, could not tell where she ended and Lilith began, but when Elster fails one last time, the line between Alina and Arion is completely gone, and all that is left is Arion. When Arion appears to her in the desert, Elster finally remembers her promise in its entirety. The real Elster has now awoken, ready to experience the dream loop one last time. In the final loop, Elster has to make one of 4 choices. The leave ending is acquired by playing as cowardly as possible, afraid to fight and afraid to die. Too scared to make the sacrifice. In this ending, Arion's thoughts of Elster leaving her are all the memories she has left, and so they manifest themselves into reality. Arion's dream takes over Falca's and Elster's, becoming the red eye in the sky. She ascends to godhood, and back in reality in her cryo chamber, she is trapped as the host of a never-ending dream of heartbreak, pain, and suffering, one where Elster left her to die. In the memory ending, Falca wins, becoming both the Elster who won't kill Arion, but also is still Falk who wants to be with Arion. This ending requires a mixed playstyle, as it mirrors how both Falk's and Elster's identity gets mixed up. When we see Arion at the end, we still see Elster reaching out to her, but all Arion sees is Falca. This is why she doesn't recognize Elster. Falk's dream has taken over everything, leaving everything unanswered for eternity. In the promise ending, Elster dies and dies and dies. Each death is a sacrifice in the name of love. Elster's dream and obsession with seeing her promise through to the end takes over everything. She reaches Arion's deathbed and fulfills her promise. The only problem is, it doesn't break the loop. It does something worse. In this final dream of hers, Elster gets to have her happy ending, believing she had finished what she started. But the truth is, Arion is still alive, and now her dream loop is forever returning to when Elster kills Arion over and over. What Elster intended to be one final selfless act is secretly a tragic and selfish act that only made things worse for Arion, and by extension, worse for Falca. The artifact ending is not necessarily the true ending, but it is definitely, in my view, the ideal one. This is the ending where Elster deciphers the true nature of the dream within all three dreams. She accomplishes this by figuring out where the three signals are coming from using her radio and completing the process of triangulation. The first signal is detected in one of the cages inside the Sierpinski torture room. Here she finds the key of love. The second signal is found through an Isle of the Dead painting sitting in the lowest floor of the mining facility. This gives Elster the key of eternity. The third and last signal is decoded next to a bookshelf on Arion's home planet of Rotfront. The bookstore belonged to Lilith Ito and her twin daughters, Erica and Isa. Since the shelf contained books that were supposed to be confiscated, it is most likely that the King in Yellow sat on that same shelf. And here's why. The dream is not simply made up of its three hosts, but the memories of those who they remember, alive or dead, are dragged into the dream as well. Isa Ito is one of them. The reason she appears in the dream and her sister Erica does not is because Arion never met Erica at the Rotfront bookstore, even if she mistook her for Isa from time to time. Speaking of the bookstore, Arion did mention that the Ito family actually had the King in Yellow book in their possession against the rules of the nation. In this dream, Isa searches tirelessly for Erica, but never actually finds her. Up until she ends up on Rotfront, she is not aware that she is part of a dream that isn't hers. It is only when she ends up back at her own bookstore that she learns the truth. When she does, she looks at the mirror and sees that she lost her right eye. This is not an actual infection, it is a metaphor, symbolical of the revelation that this dream is not her own. The eye is a symbol that distinguishes those with control over the dream and those without. This is why Arion is perceived as the red eye in the sky, why Falca has an eidetic module located in a safe on Sierpinski, and why the main menu is a depiction of Elster's eye, whereas Isa and Adler end up losing their eye, showing that in this dream they are nothing more than bystanders, they're puppets. The fact that Isa learns of her true nature at the bookstore is what suggests that there was a King in Yellow book on that shelf. The truth within the book shatters her reality, and she loses her eye. Same goes for Adler, who repeatedly discovers his lack of autonomy over the dream every single time Isa stabs him in the right eye. Adler is the only powerless participant who is aware of the causal loop. This is why he sheds his mask and declares his hate for everything every time he arrives at the gate of nowhere. This is also why he never dies. Unlike Isa, who gives up on the dream and exits the moment she finds out she can never find Erica, Adler does not give up on his quest to make a difference in the dream. He keeps pushing Elster down the elevator, but the fall doesn't stop her from coming back. He keeps hunting down Isa, but she always gets the upper hand and he always falls through a hole that takes him to nowhere. In his final appearance, he attempts to stop Elster from crossing the gate one last time. Two things happen in this scene. Adler successfully stabs Elster in the right eye, but Elster bites back, shooting Adler in his right eye and destroying it again. An eye for an eye. The irony is that Adler thinks he succeeded at changing something within the dream, but all he accomplished is that which he was always destined to do. Prince Siegfried has once again been deceived by the sorcery. In his final attempt at autonomy, it instead dawns on him that this dream will never be his to control. Elster getting stabbed in the right eye was an act of predestination. It was always meant to happen, as it is a symbol of her finally coming to grips with the sacrifice she has to make at the end of the dream loop. In order to fulfill her promise, she knows she will have to lose control over the dream, and that is why she loses her right eye. But something interesting happens in the secret fourth ending. When Elster deciphers all 3 signals and gets all the keys, the safe in Arion's bedroom can finally be opened. In all the other endings, Elster picks up the King in Yellow on the desk a second time. In the beginning, the book revealed to her that she was dead. In the end, the book revealed to her another truth, the truth she needed to accept to fulfill her promise to Arion. But in the secret ending, Elster does not pick up the King in Yellow. In other words, she realizes that things do not have to end this way, that she does not need to fulfill her destiny, or rather, predestiny. This is how Elster ends up breaking the cycle, not with a death, but with a change of thinking. If she were to complete the prophecy of the King in Yellow by killing Falca, she proves she has no autonomy over the dream. But if she breaks the pattern and bypasses fighting her altogether, she proves herself as the one with the most power over the dream, the ability to change destiny, becoming not just a god, but a savior. This is the only ending where Elster does not end up losing her eye. The only ending where Elster finally sees the bigger picture, the whole picture. With the 3 keys of love, eternity, and sacrifice, Elster has accomplished that which is necessary to end the suffering of this nightmare. The 3 missing pieces to the cube that can finish this story once and for all. Using the 3 keys to open the safe, she retrieves the symbol of her and Arion's fondest memory, the most beautiful and meaningful moment of their entire lives. It is the small houseplant that Arion had on board the Penrose. With this final memento, Elster no longer needs to fight Falca, or to confront Adler, or to bear the pain of either keeping her promise or failing to see it through. All of this can be put aside and left in the past. With Arion's houseplant now in her possession, Elster uses the 6 plates, the 6 sides to this story, to initiate a ritual. She returns back to nowhere and turns each plate into a pillar surrounding Arion's cryo chamber. 5 copies of Elster lie dead against 5 of the pillars, with only the last one left. She places the plant on top of the last pillar, and she returns to her final resting place, giving up the ghost in the machine. Elster dies one last time, and as she does so, all she remembers is that single memory of her and Arion dancing to beautiful music and falling asleep together. This is what lies beyond the gate for Elster, because this is what she decided that she wants to believe, what she wants to remember. And with that sheer, unstoppable bioresonant power in her mind's eye, she transmits this memory to Arion and Falca, ending the nightmare of a loop that can never be broken. There's no way to end the dream loop, but when such a horrible nightmare can turn into such everlasting bliss, the most magical, most unforgettable moment of life, frozen forever in time, maybe it doesn't have to. With that final memory, everyone gets the illusion of a happy ending. Elster no longer has to beat herself up over a failed promise. Arion no longer has to endure eternal suffering without Elster. And Falca's false memories as Elster, dancing with Arion on the Penrose, can now also be hers forever. In the end, I could be wrong about all of this, but when the story makes all the sense in the world to me by piecing it together this way, I don't have to be right. It just has to be right for me. All that really matters is that SIGNALIS is an absolute masterpiece, and that Rose Engine has crafted one of the finest, most nuanced, thought-provoking, and emotional stories that this medium has ever seen. It is, arguably, the most perfect psychological horror game ever created. It belongs in the pantheon of the greatest horror classics, but it also transcends the horror genre entirely. Between this, the Callisto Protocol, and the Dead Space remake, Signalis might not be the most fun of the bunch to just sit down and play, but it is the most meaningful and profound one to experience. Signalis is so much cheaper than the other two games, and yet it is the one that I will value the most. That should be more than enough reason to buy the game and support those who worked on it, who put so much love and care into making Signalis the undisputable masterpiece that it is. It's an eye-opening experience that will resonate with players for a long time. On top of its extremely competent game design, it offers a mind-bending story and a lesson about the important things in life. It is what we do with the time that we have and how we spend it with those who we love, those who are worth sacrificing everything for, and how in doing so, we leave this world with the outcomes that grant us eternal happiness. That is what truly matters. We will never know what awaits us when we die, but as long as we do whatever needs to be done and decide who we truly want to be in life, the time to see all 6 sides of our story, of our twisted little cube, will eventually come. And until then, whatever lies beyond the gate, whatever it is, it doesn't matter.